And I guess we're missing Linda, who is chairing the session, but I feel like I know most of you, so we can skip the introduction. My name is Frauke Kreuter. I'm the director of the Joint Program and Survey Methodology and head of the Statistical Methods Group at the Institute of Employment Research in Germany. And what I'm going to say is sort of bridging a little bit between the knowledge I've gained in Germany and the knowledge I gained here. And Linda, I took over your job too, if that's okay.
Are you telling me I'm late? I thought I was right on time. Okay, no, that's okay.
All right. This
I'm glad you're enthusiastic about doing this, Frauke.
I am. Actually, I was very enthusiastic about the whole workshop series, and I think it's great that SCSM and WSS and, I mean, actually a lot of groups in DC are working on this topic. But I do, and you know, as enthusiastic as I am, it's also felt quite a challenge, Linda, when you called me up and said, can you then summarize on the fly all three workshops, you know, where one is not even over, you know. And so this is a tall order. Luckily, I'm tall, so we'll see how that goes. But one thing that I did in reflecting on what I heard in the first two workshops and what I heard today, and where's Paul? I promised I would call him out. There you go. Oh, good. Well, I'll start with you. So the one thing that I noticed, and I was very glad to hear Paul talk about his framework and switching back and forth between a framework applying to a data set and a framework applying to an estimator. But I think he could have gone even more down that path, to be honest. And so I challenge you all, you know, to sort of think a little bit like on, you know, as you look at the lessons we learned across these three workshops and the successful examples we've seen, you know, just, you know, take your inner ear and sum up Roberto Rubinbong when he was talking about the consumer price index. He was talking about a success story on one statistic, right, getting that inflation index right. Your example, Paul, was an example on this one estimator, and that's where you went into detail. But you made an interesting comment, right, which was, oh, if we have coverage error on that data set, then this translates into a coverage bias on the estimate. And I think that's wrong. And you know it's wrong, too, because we all know that a non-response rate on a survey doesn't translate into non-response bias per se. But it's easy, I think, to sort of fall back into we have an error framework that looks at an entire data set rather than a statistic we want to produce. And if you look closely on what Raghu did, right, he had like a whole list of estimators, calibration versus the other source, the original survey. And the values were quite different. I mean, in one swooping sentence you said, all your physicians said, oh, yeah, calibrated is better, but they were quite different in how much better they were. And I bet it wasn't all, you know, exactly saying that, right? And so I do think that in reflecting on what we've learned, it is important to sort of remember this is not about data sets. While we all cradle and crave to have a quality metric for a data set, I think we should finally toss that out of the window, right? I mean, we all know that we sort of got hung up and constrained by the 80% response rate requirements that you guys luckily had to suffer through more than I did, but we know that's not the right way to go about this problem. And so I think it is important as we summarize what we've learned or what we still need to learn from these workshops, that we remind ourselves it's really about the outcome variables that we are trying to accomplish. So that's, you know, and this is not me saying something new. I'm just summarizing what I heard. If you really hear the subtext that was in your talk, Paul, the subtext that was in your talk, Raghu, but also what we've seen on the record linkage and whatnot. Everyone has that in there somewhere. You know, it works for some variables, it works for some estimates, but it's hard to say that overall. And of course, it's even harder, as John, in your beautiful literature review, and I'm so glad I didn't have to do it. I could just listen to you. Please write it up so that I can listen to it again. But you know, these frameworks, as much as I like them and I teach them, right, they're sort of tempting to just apply them to an entire data set. And I think that's with these blended products, not where we're going to be. So I think that's one lesson that we do want to take away from these workshops. Another one that I felt like I saw more and more, again, today in the talks, but also in the others, was that we really need to get more comfortable with proxies of what we try to measure, whether this is our outcome variable or whether this is our covariates that we have there. For certain things, we're not going to be perfect ever. And, many of you said that quite nicely. All of these data sources have errors, and then while saying it in the same talk, swooping right in and saying, oh, we use the survey as a gold standard. I did that too, I have plenty of papers where I used the administrative data as the gold standard, fully knowing that's not true. But again, it does depend on the outcome variable. It depends on what we're wanting to do. And John, your example there at the end was beautiful with the administrative records not being able to produce statistics on a housing unit level. Big problem, this is like what I hear about every other week in Germany. Because I'm only there every other week. I'm sure they talk every week about it. But the thing is that, I often then wonder, it's like, why do you need it at the household level? Well, it's because you got used to a certain reporting system across Europe that started with household surveys. And then you get sort of, this is to me the exact same idiocy? Yeah. That journals have when they still require me to put the tables on separate pages at the very end. This is from days when we used typewriters and couldn't do this in the same document. And so in the same way, I think we get sort of stuck on certain reporting ways and how statistics that are just not adequate for the problem we're trying to solve. And so which is the right unit of analysis that we even need, or statistics? Maybe a lot of things we don't need at the individual level or at the household level, right? And this goes hand in hand with the proxy. I think we need to sort of magically get some air in this room, but also into our heads that maybe for the actual problems we try to solve, we could do away with the different form of statistic and the different form of reporting. And seeing Nancy there, I think you would agree on that. We have conversations on this a lot, and I think that it is important and hard. I've been pulled into several sort of review panels for certain surveys, and in all of them, they pull out the mysterious stakeholder. Well, all these stakeholders. I never met the stakeholders. They were not in the room when we discussed. Sometimes they were or they channeled the stakeholders, but every time I would ask, so is the stakeholder putting down money to get the question at that level? No. And the answer was always no. I haven't met a stakeholder yet that was willing to put down some money. So then I wonder, how important are these stakeholders for us? It's in part we sort of got used to a certain way of doing our business, and I'm not sure if we have to keep doing the business that way. So that would be my summary from these workshops. What I've learned and what I feel like I've heard here, I think the examples we have seen are terrific. And I can only, shudder to think how much work that was for all those poor students that were in the ... of Raghu's talk to prepare these administrative data sets, And then I'm thinking, okay, so the next person around that wants to use the medical claims data or what have you, they have to do the whole thing again. And then the next one has to do the whole thing again. We have absolutely not talked about how we're going to share code, things we learned, so that we can use this, just like we use a data set, then for another purpose, right? A survey data set. We discussed here, or you more than I did, for the last 20 years, how we can share data sets and get that across the silo line. But in this other world, it's not just about sharing eventually the access to the administrative data, it's also all the other stuff. And in terms of workload, I keep saying to people who say, we're going to reduce all these costs. Well, I don't think so. I think you're going to shift costs from spending a lot of time and effort prior to the data collection so that afterwards you can run a simple t-test or, some summary statistic and then you're done, to all the work afterwards. You have the data and then starts the work. But you have to find a mechanism to make that more efficient. And there was a little bit of a session on metadata. We talked about this a little bit, but not. I felt like that didn't get to that point, which was really how can we manage that we don't all have to learn the same things over and over again when working with these administrators. And now you can point to Europe and say, oh, yeah, these guys probably solved that. I can tell you, not in the agencies that I've visited, worked at, or been at. It's a big problem. I mean, at IIB, we're talking about that, too. And if I see the different units, I mean, so often is someone presenting at the seminar series, oh, you know, we did this, blah, 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 with the unemployment insurance record data, and then, you know, someone gets up and says, like, well, but, you know, I learned that this and this is really problematic, and then therefore the paper apart after being published. So this happens, and so I think we are not 10 years or decades behind trying to figure this out. We all have to figure this out, and quickly, you know. And I mean, this is a problem that all companies that produce code have to deal with, and I think there's a lot of interesting discussion going on how to create more collaborative research environments, but we have to pay attention to these discussions, and I think that's, you know, in terms of things we have not talked about here for the blended data products, certainly one. There are a couple of other lessons that I think we haven't learned yet, or not as much focus in this discussion of combined data products. Also, sort of big lager leap. You know, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's like, do we want to create monster big data products, right? Now it's not just a survey, it's a survey blended with X, Y, and Z and variables for a multi-purpose piece, right? Only then to realize we have a research question or a policy question that then can't be answered because that wasn't exactly what they need. They need something else, right? And so these big elephants that we've been used to producing, maybe that's not the right way forward. And again, you know, drawing on an example here from Germany, we had, you know, some of you might know this study from the 20s, you know, the unemployment study in a town in Austria called Marienthal. There was a big, massive layoff in that town, and they wanted to see what that does, you know, to all the unemployed. And then there was, you know, Paul Lazarsfeld and a couple of others were farmed out, and they started observing people, right? And they were standing on the bridge and measure how long it takes people to walk over the bridge and, you know, do all kinds of observational measures. At least in Germany or in German-speaking countries, this has hugely affected how people think on how reintegration into the labor market works, what the devastating effects of long-term unemployment are, because you do slow down. That's sort of the key message, right? It's like all of a sudden it was noon, you know. That's sort of the highlight sentence of that book. But the thing is, you know, we still wonder about this. None of the instruments we have, I mean, I have at the IIB my hands on every single employment spell since 1971 of anyone who ever paid Social Security in Germany. It's great, right? I can learn all kinds of stuff. This, I cannot learn with it, you know. And I cannot learn with it if I pen survey data to it either. It's a completely new thing, what I need to do to answer that research question, which we happen to do right now by using the measurement instruments that we have in our pockets. And, you know, we subsampled out of the administrative data set people that are part of a survey, and we are installing an app on their phone and sort of passively measure how fast they go. Not here to talk about that study, but okay, now I am in a situation where I add big data to administrative data to survey data, and of course I have a huge coverage problem for the kind of question that I want to answer, right? So again, I'm in a situation where I need to evaluate, well, if what I try to measure is limited to Android devices, right? Who is missing? You know, I can't dish out Android devices to everybody, but who is missing, and is that missingness relative to my outcome variable important, right? Luckily, most people can't afford the iPhones, and so, you know, Android devices are pretty widely spread, but, you know, among those 60 plus, the smartphone use, not so great maybe overall, and certainly none of the devices really strong, except old Germans really like Windows phones. Just, you know, if you have to take nothing away from this talk, this could be a good thing to tweet out. as I said, the point is, this is a coverage study we have done to learn a little bit more here. We all know what happens next, right? We weight our data accordingly. We make sensitivity analyses of what we try to do at the very end, holds for these subgroups, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? In order to get this published, I need to do a whole lot of work to sort of convince people that the various data sources I pulled in work, right? And I will do this, or need to do this for every study of that type. So they will not be a big quality metric, it's a continuous convincing. And if I do this study again in 5 years, it might look entirely different because other phone providers are on the market, or no one is using phones anymore, what have you. So, while, it's fun to get a paper published in JASA and, demonstrate that you can combine errors, so the different data sources, in this case, surveys from the IRB and their administrative data, and showing whatnot. It's a constant effort. It's not we demonstrated this once for this combined data set. It is a mindset that we have to change. It's a mindset that we have to build in this evaluation process. Not this one-time thing, John, that you mentioned, that stopped in 2001. For every survey product, we do this once. And we know it's not true for the surveys either. That's why this whole Teradata stuff happened, right? We started collecting these Teradata and analyzing and to see a little bit better what's going on in the process because we realized we cannot come up with one single indicator that tells us something about survey quality. And, I would argue the same is true for the blended data. If it's a blended data source that uses the calibrated base that Raghu was talking about, well, you go to Raghu and then it's like, okay, if you do that, what do you need to look at, right? And every product, but no, really every policy question will have a different need here. Okay, so how do we get there? I don't think we get there by having one policy document. I think we only get there if we can have a much larger base of people being aware of these problems, knowing how to fix them, and speaking the language. That doesn't mean that everyone has to become a survey statistician. It just needs to be at a point where we enable enough people that actually try to answer these policy questions also to work with the data or to at least know what the information is we provide to them, right? And so, we have, if you look back at the April Task Force report that Lily Yapek and I chaired, and it had a lot of different people, not from the federal agencies or the statistical community in it, but, policy people and computer scientists and what have you. In the end, every discussion sort of boils down to these 5 steps that cover topics that you see in a lot of data science programs. And, I only happen to know my own, but, this is not the point of advertising. It's just of getting an entire community to sort of see what we are doing with the data. It's a literacy expansion at a very different level. And, in our attempts, and Paul just left, but I was going to ask him about UNC's attempt, because in both at Maryland and UNC, you see now this blending of a curriculum that includes courses designed to teach you how to use these other data sets with the survey knowledge we have, Because if we do want to have good understanding of these blended products, we need people who have good understanding of both pieces, right? And so I think we can only get there if we combine, this instructional set through different skills on purpose in this online program that we designed here with the help of the German government funds and funds from JPSM. On purpose pulled in people from the private sector and companies that traditionally don't do surveys, but happen to, actually do a lot more surveys when you look closely. I think end of January at Facebook and at Google, and was astonished to hear how many surveys they do and how they clamor for more survey knowledge, just like we clamor for more knowledge on how they use their big data sets. Trying to save some time here, so let me hone in on that last piece that I said at the beginning. Why I think it's so important that we build an environment in which a lot of people understand that knowledge, but also an environment in which we can share what we learn about these data. And the one example I want to give here was this education activity that actually Nancy Potok and friends at Census initiated. When was that, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when they first asked Julia Lane to design a course that sort of brings their employees up to speed. And since in last year we taught 180 people out of a lot of different state, local, county, and federal agencies. And these were not service statisticians. These were not, by and large, not people from our industry and in this room here. But these are people who make these decisions, who have the policy question, and who need to work with these data also, right? What was so interesting for me to see these guys paired up with some participants from Census or, BJS, some of you of NAF have sent people there, was to see how crucial it was to have a team and a conversation about the data sets, the meaning of these variables, the actual purpose of this, how often would a statistic needed to be re-estimated in order to make sure it stays current and the like. And Raghu, I was going to ask you in your talk, you mentioned the physicians at the very end, but I bet that in this process of deciding what is the weight for the survey and the admin data and what have you, you had to have conversations with physicians and people who actually know something about this. This can't be done without, right? And so I think it is, in the end, a form of teamwork that we need, and a teamwork that, in this case, the most basic environment you could imagine on the Amazon cloud, this brings you back in the days of sort of, program or command line coding, an Ubuntu environment, mostly because there's no property issues associated with them and no licensing fees. But what in the simple environment that these guys, these 180 people worked in teams with these various data sets that you can see listed here, or probably not because this is too small, but the Illinois Department of Human Service data, the Employment Services data, the wage records, the Department of Correction records, those data sets in the past didn't meet. The people who work with these data sets in the past didn't meet, but they were in an environment where they can share and their code and they can learn from each other. And that's we need to bring that into the conversation. And so on the pieces that I think we still need to learn, I would like to sort of give that on its way. And, Peter Miller not here, but smiling on the slide, hope he agrees. So this teamwork, or this, it's great that we are having this conversation here, but I think we need to have it with a set of other people with whom we in the future also should work. Okay. So these are my comments, Linda. Back over to you. I hope I saved some time so that we can actually.
You did well. You did really well.
And I do think it was provocative. I'm in panic mode, if you want to know the truth. And let me explain why. And I think this is something else we've kind of got to get out on the table, is our agency puts out 7 principal economic indicators. People count on those. We aren't getting any more money, newsflash for everyone in this room, I'm sure. And so in a time of declining budgets, we feel like we need to evolve. We want to change. We're not getting increasing people. We're not getting increasing resources. And yet at the same time, you feel like you got to change right now. And that is a scary time. And I keep reminding myself of what Mary said at lunch. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So how do we get started on the marathon so that we can't do it all at one time? What is important for us to do? So that's one of my questions, but I'm open to other suggestions, other topics that you might want to discuss. Does anyone have anything to say? Yeah, Raghu.
After listening to your talk, I was thinking, I'm put on 2 hats. one hat is about estimating the particular quantity that I'm interested in, a particular indicator that I'm interested in. I'm making set of assumptions when I'm integrating these data to produce that particular statistic. The quality measures are relative to that estimation and what assumptions that I'm making in bringing these two data together and in order to produce a particular estimate. At the same time, I'm also putting the other hat where I'm putting out this integrated data set with this 107 dummy variables and then this covariates and so on, which are multiply imputed data sets out for the people to do their own analysis. And I don't have a control over what analysis they're going to do. So wearing that hat, I kind of think about is the assumptions that I'm making about producing that data set, does it impose any limitations on what kind of analysis they can or they cannot do? So in that sense, I think it is end product is two different things. So one is producing an estimate or producing a particular answer, inferential question about a policy. That's a different kind of assumptions and qualifications and so on that I have to document. The other is I'm producing a data set for anybody, epidemiologist or anybody else to use. So I constantly struggle between defining my quality in terms of these two modes of operation. One is about the data set, one is about the estimate. Now, and Bill gave a very good, excellent example. I think we can pursue that. So, for example, if you're measuring a concept called poverty, and then you have two ways of measuring it, and suppose you think the good way of measuring it is available only for a small subset of areas, and relatively bad way of measuring it is available for all areas. And that's a struggle that we did in our paper in small area estimation, is that HIS gave us the estimate. We thought that was really good, but only for a very small number of areas. But the other surveys, we thought that it may be relatively not that good because it has a low response rate and so on. So, but it gave a data for all the areas. So the struggle is, in that case, is that under what assumptions I am better off using both as opposed to just throwing away the one. So it's kind of it is both. So if I'm producing a data set so that others can use it, then I have to really think about limitations of what I have done in creating the data set, and how do I communicate that if I assume the three-factor interactions to be zero, I have to tell them is that I have assumed the three-factor interactions to be zero. Don't go and search for them. You won't find them, right? So it's kind of a both. And I think, again, the agencies are also also kind of a debate about this, and whether you are creating the 7 indicators or whether you're giving out this integrated data set for all other people to analyze. You may want to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. I don't have to worry about that. We can't give out the data set. So I think Census has made progress on synthetic data that could be shared. But our focus, and let me see, how many from the agencies can give out your data sets? Okay, there's some. So that is a relevant question for us. How many of you cannot give out your data sets? All right. So we have a mix, right? So I do think, so that is something that's important for us to think about, is whether it's the estimator we're focusing on or the data set that we're focusing on. Raka?
Yeah, I just, we are not in disagreement, Regular, but let me push you on that a little bit. I mean, in the data set that you created there, right? Do you really go through all the possible uses and say, oh, can be done, cannot be done, cannot be done? Have we ever done that with any of the surveys we've done? No, right? We create this elephant, and then we finally find a way to put it out in the street, and then it's left to the user, right? And so in your way too, I mean, I would be curious to hear, and I think it does depend on how, I mean, all of these examples that you guys nicely assembled are very different, right? And so they all have to go through this, but the key thing and then too is whatever assumption was in there when you created it, would you do it the next time with the slightly different data set or update for the next year? You would need to relook at them anyway, right? It's not that you're done for once and there's sort of one, quality stamp on it and it's good forever, right?
So when I create an elephant, I have to describe that elephant, right? So that description has to be there for the data. But if I modify that elephant, then I have to say, well, I modified this elephant. But I'm still sure that it won't be valid for every analysis that anybody wants.
So the real question is, you have to describe the elephant you've created, right? What kinds of descriptors, what kind of measures of quality should we have associated with those data sets or with the estimator? Isn't that really the question? You're not so sure, Frock, I can tell. You don't agree.
Okay, well, I didn't realize that I would be in charge of defending all of this, but good. I mean, I can be. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, so there's a lot of things we haven't done right in the past, Can I see a show of hands of those who are always, with every regression you ever did a regression diagnostic and looked at the residuals before you glanced at the coefficients? Yeah, that's what I thought, And so I think, I mean, there are lots of examples, in the stuff we do where we already not holding ourselves to the standards, but where we should. And where would you see it if it was done or not? You would see it in code, And that's why I think it is important that maybe it is not the data set that you put out. Maybe it's pieces of code, that people can use and apply, and they know if I have that problem, I use this or go here. I mean, I'm not claiming I know how the solutions look like. I just feel like if we just think in the same box we've been at in the past and that now try to sort of stuff in the new data sets and see how this still fits, I don't think we will get anywhere. I think I'm repeating myself.
And
Nancy wants to jump in.
Yeah, Nancy, come on up. You have to speak into one of these mics. It's our challenge. I don't think I want to stay in the box. I just don't want to fall off the cliff when I break out.
This discussion is taking an interesting turn. And I would like to share a little bit of thinking about this, just in terms of a context or maybe a framework in which the workshops are taking place, and at least from the standpoint of the federal statistical system. And kind of address Linda's question about, like, how do you even get started, and is this a sprint or a marathon? So I think we're conflating some things in this discussion. On the one hand, we have the federal statistical agencies who are producing products on a regular basis, very much production shops, not doing research, but research on how to improve production, basically, not research necessarily all the time, although I think there is some research going on how to solve the big policy problems of the world. In general and traditionally, the federal statistical agencies have said we will provide the data, but we are not going to do the program evaluation or some of these other more in-depth research things that actually answer the big policy questions themselves. So when the federal statistical system is doing research, it's really around can we produce faster, better, more granular, other types of things that will help other people answer those questions. All right, so when we're thinking about combined data and the pressures on the federal statistical agencies, we have a spectrum of kind of experience and products, some of which have been produced for decades, like GDP, and some others that I could name that have been combining data for a very long time. In other instances, we have new pressures that have arisen. For example, on the American Community Survey, it's too long, according to some. So then the pressure is, are there administrative records or commercial data that could substitute for specific variables in that survey without compromising the quality and maybe address some problems, like if there's a particular question like income where there's a big drop-off rate, right? Could you use tax records and get the income? And would you get better quality? Same thing with a survey like SIP, where since it's longitudinal, people tend to drop off. There's a lot of research that's done that says that if you pull from administrative records, you may be getting more accurate answers than people's recollections of when they're on particular benefit programs. Or, all the work that NASA's done to say, can we use aerial photography instead of asking about particular crowd questions? So there's a whole range of things going on. And when, it struck me when you said, who are the stakeholders? Because, frankly, to me, you're a stakeholder of the federal statistical system. You're a stakeholder because you're taking the statistical data and you're doing other research with it, which is quite important. The work that's going on working with the state and the local agencies to get them to take advantage of the federal data is just critical. So those are the stakeholders, and sometimes they're putting money in, sometimes they're not. But they definitely have a stake in the quality of federal statistical data. So when we're thinking in the context of the workshops and the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, and I'm thinking from the standpoint of the chief statistician and what does OMB need to do to put a stake in the ground on this, we're really thinking about, are there some, in this very complex environment, are there some general principles that we should be looking at with regard to quality and transparency that really apply to the federal statistical agencies so that the users and the stakeholders understand what they're getting, so that there are some models out there, like a total error model. If you started to get new data sets that suddenly were substituting variables in that weren't coming from the survey anymore, you would probably want to know certain things about where did it come from and how good is it and what process did the agency go through before they just stuck this in. So I think that's where we're at. And, some of the reproducibility issues and things like that, those haven't, what has changed is, I think, sort of the privacy and the disclosure environment and thinking about privacy budgets and things like that. That's what's changed. But I think from the standpoint of the federal statistical agencies, microdata is microdata, and it's probably either protected by tax laws or Title 13 or SIPC or something like that for the most part, as soon as it is combined. Whatever these sources, as soon as it gets combined, that legal protection takes hold. So I just don't want to get confused about why we're having the workshops and where we're headed and the kinds of things that in the FCSM conference coming up, some of the research that's been done is really geared towards answering these types of questions. How fast can we go? How sure do we have to be looking at things from a cost-benefit standpoint, that we're actually improving the data by substituting in or bringing in new data sets. And then what do we tell people about it so they know how to use it? The work that goes into using it post-release from a federal statistical agency is a whole other topic. And it's an important one, and I'm sure it's really important to researchers who want to get the data and who also want to do their own combining of data that maybe the Federal Statistical Agency is not going to do, but, you can go to Research Data Center and link records and do all kinds of evaluations and studies, which people are doing.
I'm glad, Nancy, that you're clarifying this, and
Here's one. I think it turned.
I'm glad you clarified and sort of called me out on conflating things so that I have the chance to clarify. I understand that this framework is important and that we need something like that. And that's why I said I love to teach them, and I do teach them, and unfortunately all that. But I do think what I tried to point out is that I felt like Paul's distinction between a framework for an entire data set and a framework for an estimate is so crucial. And so and it is my impression in listening to all these examples that it becomes very clear for given statistics, for a statistical indicator, or for one purpose, that you can go through the exercise and then do the different error sources, the different measurement error of the 2 different or 3 different data sources that are used, cancel it either out or are they additive or what have you. What I think won't work, or at least that's what I'm setting out here to discuss, is that I think it's too tall of an order if we try to have a framework that works for the entire elephant, as we call it, for the entire data set, because it does so much depend on what that statistic or that indicator is that you want to do. And so when I pushed for code and transparency on that wasn't so much about the reproducibility, more in there are so many decisions going on when you start using the administrative data and massage them so that they fit the blended data product. And these decisions would look slightly different if your outcome interest is slightly different, and even within the data set that the Federal Statistical System produces. And so that's what I try to do.
So I think we see that right now, where how many questions are there across the Federal Statistical System right now that ask about health insurance coverage, as an example, because everyone has a slightly different question that they're trying to answer. So we have multiple questions across multiple surveys asking the same thing. Is it good or bad? Well, it's sort of, the horse is out of the barn on that one. But maybe we should be thinking about those things ahead of time when we're thinking about, well, how are we bringing in variables in the questions that we're answering so we don't end up with this duplication across the system because we're answering a slightly different question. So I think that's a very valid point that we should be thinking about up front, as opposed to waiting for everyone to do their own thing and suddenly finding out, well, everybody was pulling this variable from CMS or from some record somewhere, but treating it slightly differently, answering a slightly different question and coming up with, completely different things, and then we're left in that same zone that we're in now where we have multiple surveys kind of addressing the same topic, and we're trying to reconcile all the different answers and constantly explain to people, this is a snapshot, this is longitudinal, this is, an annual number type of thing. This is a monthly number. So they're all different, and it's very confusing. So I do think it's something we have to think about in that regard, and it's a very good point.
John.
Thanks. Appreciate everybody's comments. Here, especially what we've been hearing both from Nancy and from Frauke. If I could flesh out a couple of things here. Remember our stated goal that we had. We covered it early today. We talked about it in the previous 2 workshops. Everything we're talking about here is wonderful. Eventually, we need to address all of those in a lot of depth. To a large degree, when we're talking about trying to have some kind of transparent reporting on quality, trying to find what you might call a very basic grammar, at least to cover some of our production. That's the goal that we have right now. Eventually, we very much hope that that grammar and the resulting body of practice that we're able to expose and discuss using that grammar will, in fact, offer insights into how we can improve. And we saw a number of discussions today, perhaps especially with Frauke, John, and with Paul, that were aiming in that direction. Very much like all of that. A second comment, and so we very much hope to have this as a start of a conversation, but as we were discussing with some folks at lunch, we are very confident, in fact, this is a multi-decade exercise. We're trying to get a point at which we get a little bit of traction to start with on this. And all the discussions we've had today in the two previous workshops are very helpful in that. A second point to bear in mind is a discussion of so-called public good that Frauke especially was touching on, Nancy was touching on indirectly. There's a wonderful body of literature largely at the interface between political science and economics, and they're referred to as public goods. The formal language related to that is a public good is something that is, quote, non-exclusive and non-rivalrous. Idea of non-exclusive is I can use it, Frauke can use it. The fact that Frauke is using it, in fact, doesn't take anything away from me, and in fact, it's actually beneficial in most cases. The fact that we have some kind of common basis for having some discussion is actually a wonderful thing. Highways, public national parks, and things like that are often pointed to as examples, but a number of people point out that federal statistics as such are, in fact, some of the purest public goods that we have, and the same is true for most other countries. That's the good news. The caution is that even though we use that language of public goods and we have a body of expectations related to that and a body of practice in some fashion related to that, we always have to recognize that, in fact, there are certain constituencies and often production of a particular source of information was originated for one particular purpose, and then the rest are in some ways added on top of that. Here are a couple of examples. We have at least a few people here from the BLS who work on the Consumer Price Index. And the lecture that we have in orientation for anybody who's involved with the Consumer Price Index, lecture number 1, is that the whole reason for the original development of consumer price indices in the United States was specifically tied to cost of living for shipyard workers during World War I, okay, a very specific need that was arising. Government had to have some kind of basis for negotiating with these shipyard organizations about when the appropriate wage rate and appropriate inflation is going to be. That has now morphed into an enormous amount of other uses, and in fact, right now, if we were to say, what's the number one reason that we have a consumer price index now, very few people would say shipyard workers based on either right now or at any point in the last several decades. We would say Social Security, for example, and Social Security benefit inflators, or, actually there are a whole lot of other contracts that are now linked in with consumer price index. There is a degree of growth and, in some ways, evolution of usage over the course of time. We do have to keep an eye on that. As we've been here discussed before, I'll say it in a more explicit way, if in fact you try to have an absolutely pure public good and you try to optimize everybody's utility function associated with a very large number of different estimands and the procedures by which we would go about doing it, very quickly you step back and any mathematician will say you have a completely incoherent and unrealistic set of expectations. Somewhere we have to focus, and starting with shipyard workers and then perhaps morphing into Social Security is one way that we can get a little bit of traction on that. Another example is Bill's still here. If I understand correctly, the primary reason for SAPE to begin with was specifically tied with certain types of formula funding allocation driven largely by the Department of Education. But nonetheless, we see an awful lot of other uses for SAPE and similarly small area products at this point. Lynn can probably make similar comments about small area estimation either from her perspective. At NASS, you may have a key need to understand something about that level of relatively fine geographical levels and change taking place. But once you have something out there, you do have other types of activities. Same is true for other public goods like public parks, national defense. You go back and look at the original authorizing language for the interstate highway systems, it was national defense was the primary goal. Again, up that, but we have many other uses for this public good. That's worth bearing in mind. It doesn't make Nancy's job any easier. Nancy would have a much easier job if every single survey or every single data collection or estimation procedure we had exactly one set of constituents with exactly one univariate estimand and simply say, go minimize this mean squared error in the discussion. We don't live in that environment. We live in a much more rich and complex environment. I keep trying to tell all of my colleagues, though, you can either get really frustrated and say this is an incoherent, ill-posed problem, or you can say, golly, isn't this fascinating? Can we find sub-problems for which, again, first of all, for the purpose of these workshops, we can say, can we at least get a common language to discuss those sub-problems? Understanding is not going to be comprehensive. And then if we have language, can we at least solve a little bit some of those sub-problems? That's what we're trying to do here.
I just wanted to add something interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Something interesting. So I remember you mentioned the policy. So I'm a statistician in statistical agency. I'm moving to, let's say, Office of Assistant Secretary of Policy. Then I will be a user because I will be using exactly the data to model and produce those policy inferences. But the statistical agency statistical agencies are operated based on the principles and practices of National Institute of Sciences Organization, which distinguishes that we do not produce policy inference. So I remember I used to work in policy inference before, but I do not work anymore. So I think that makes it very clear cut that one of the missions is we disseminate information. That means we have to produce a data set for researchers. And if I'm hired by Office of Policy Evaluation, I'll be using those data sets. But the moment I choose my hat to change and come to a statistical agency, I leave that hat away and I become producer of the data, disseminate, and make sure it's impartial, make sure that we do not confound any policy question of administration with the statistical product. So, yeah, I think I just want to share that.
I think Catherine had a question, and I walked the microphone over. I do want to go on record that I love the federal statistical system. I think this is incredible, important work. I was charged by Linda to make sure we sort of get to the bottom of the puzzle that we need to solve and summarize what we've discussed. So I just want to make sure you guys know that. I do respect you.
No, you're doing a good job, Frauke. You're doing a good job.
Thank you, Frauke. I actually put my hand down, so I was going off on a different direction. We didn't have any time after Paul's presentation to discuss the frameworks that he laid out. And I did want to comment on that and maybe have a little discussion of it. I thought it was a very nice framework, but where he lost me, I guess, was when he started attaching numbers to the framework. So in order to use the framework to evaluate the quality of blended data and whether the blended data were an improvement on what you started with, he wanted to each of those quality dimensions assign a score of 1, 2, or 3. And I'm sorry he's not here because I really wanted to ask him how he would go about doing that. And then the other thing that I stumbled over was this idea that it made any sense to take the scores for all those different dimensions and average them and call that a score that you could use for evaluation. And I guess I bring this up not to pick on Paul, but just to say I would be really uncomfortable about going that route in terms of coming up with a quality metric that we would apply to thinking about what we were doing with blended data.
I'm so glad you said something, because as I was listening to Paul's talk, I was thinking these are all qualitative measures, not quantitative measures, and then all of a sudden we had something quantitative there. So we have been pushing in these workshops to get quantitative measures in place. So I think that's an area where we could really use some insight if people have them. What quantitative measures do we need? Or is qualitative sufficient, at least in some cases? Probably some cases. But how do you discern which is which? I asked a stupid questions, I know.
It reminds me of what you said earlier. In order to come up with the quality measure for the entire product, in the 90s, they had to go out and collect so many additional data sources, right? And Teradata that jumped into my head when I heard that, because we got better in doing that. And I think in the same way, I'm not sure if there can be one measure or a metric, at least from the examples that I've seen through the free workshops. They all gave us the impression of much as their process, right? It's the example of the regression diagnostic, right? Did they do that? Did they not do that? I mean, that would be a qualitative indicator, but either way, out of the process, maybe tuberculosis will say the opposite.
I'm not going to say that. So I think in terms of assumptions. Every integration process, every estimation process involves assumptions. When I'm substituting A to B, or I'm predicting A based on B, there are assumptions involved. So I think my own, in this whole exercise, is I was thinking about what assumptions I'm making. These assumptions are nuts and bolts, that is linking the modules. If you consider different data sources as modules and nuts and bolts, I'm putting all these nuts and bolts. Those are all assumptions. And I think, but we do have a we do need a framework by which we can assess these assumptions. So the regression diagnostics or model diagnostics, setting aside some known values and seeing whether or not I'm capturing those values back. So those are all some of those validation and some validation of the assumptions, or having an external data source, like we decided up front that we are going to pretend as though MCBS is not collecting any self-report data, so that we will have something which is not part of the model or not part of the data set to assess whether or not we are reproducing the MCBS. So to me, I think it is all about all the assumptions I'm making in creating that integrated estimate or data set, and thinking, do I have a way to validate that assumption? Can I communicate that validation of the assumption? Is that these are the assumptions that I made. This could be in the form of a code. These are the assumptions that I made, and this is why I made. And this is a justification for those assumptions. I think having a quality and kind of in an abstract sense is very hard to think about, attaching a measure, but you can validate each of the assumptions. And then people can quiz me on that assumption. They can criticize me on the assumptions, and they can say that, okay, this assumption is not valid, so I will put some other new assumptions. And they may come up with a different answer. And that's all part of the uncertainty.
So let me give a very specific example where I think we do need a measure. Okay. Like everyone else, we're being pushed with our response rates dropping, and we have too much burden, so we need to reduce burden. So we have some monthly surveys where the same question is basically asked every month. Is it okay to use previously reported data, different kind of, for us, a different kind of data, alternative data? How much variation from the reported response is okay? What would be an appropriate metric in that case? And the only assumption is it's good enough. And we've got to come to grips with some of those questions. What's good enough for previously reported data that it won't have an undue impact on our estimator in the end? So to me, that's a little different from just an assumption. My assumption is it's good enough, but what metrics should I be using to assess that? We've gone over time. Okay. It has to be short.
Yes.
Less than 1 minute, Raghu.
Less than 1 minute.
Yes.
You haven't done that yet.
I'm going to start now.
Okay.
So to me, I think if I can substitute, we do that in the longitudinal analysis. In clinical trials, they used to say, last observation. So if a person drops off from the study, they would bring the previous value and substitute for the current value. And when I heard that, it didn't make any sense, because that means that deterministically there can be no change. Therefore, I would say that assumption is totally, gobbledygook.
It depends. we're asking how many acres are planted to corn. That better not be changing. You know, you might change your estimate of harvest, but acres ought to be the same all season long.
That may be different.
I wouldn't make that assumption.
So it all depends on your application. Listen, group, I think you have done an excellent job of raising more questions than have been answered here today, which is part of the purpose of these workshops. Thank you so much for coming. You'll hear some summaries at FCSM next week. It'll be interesting to see how this workshop's summarized. I'm certainly glad I don't have that job. Jennifer has that job. And then we'll also be talking about research questions. So we hope that you'll continue in this dialogue. As you get ideas, please share them with the committee. Thank you so much.